Well, hello, Richard. It's good to continue our discussion. In our previous discussion, we sort of started the discussion of reincarnation. We looked at the evidence for reincarnation, these extraordinary children from around the world. We began to unpack that evidence into a deeper understanding of the rhythms of life and the stages of human evolution that reincarnation makes possible. The restoration of the theme of the meaningfulness of the challenges that we find embedded in our life, and the opportunity to actually deepen our therapeutic interventions in the places where we are stuck, the places where we're holding pain that are rooted in our deeper history. So now, today, we take it farther. We begin to look deeper into the significance of what's the significance of the fact that we are reincarnating beings in a universe that obviously supports and nurtures and created this reincarnation dynamic.
That's a huge difference, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
to be in a living in a universe that is nurturing us, that has a kind of paternal, maternal energy, surrounding it. That has such a different framework
Yeah.
to be born into.
Yeah. Yes. And I want to mention at the outset that sometimes reincarnation thinkers go in a direction of thinking that every little bitty thing in our life has a determined quality, a deterministic quality. But I don't think we necessarily need to go there, because chance is one of the powerful elements of this universe. And so we can affirm meaning and we can affirm intentionality without putting every detail of our life into that press and ask, well, what's the meaning of this and what's the meaning of that? To affirm a larger scope of meaning, still in a world where there are chance and there are variables and there are uncertainties. What's important, I think, is understanding that the universe pays attention to how we respond to chance events as well as intentional events, that our learning and the quality of our response is carried forward and does us credit, regardless of the origin of the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, funnily enough, today recorded a short meditation, and in it, I asked people to kind of imagine the universe with crisscrossed by its fields of karma, of like this, like almost these ley lines through time and space that kind of have this karmic energy. They're rippling, and the whole of the cosmos is rippling with these fields.
Yeah.
And then I asked each person, well, I asked whoever's meditating, to send out one really beautiful thought, like just from the depth of their souls, send out a really beautiful thought into that, and see the universe respond to that, and see how it enters the field, and how the universe maybe kind of sighs and expands, and how it reaches every single tiny area, and almost like it opens up synapses in some way.
Yeah.
And just the power of the incalculable power of something like that, dropped into the ocean of time space.
Yeah.
And I found that like a really powerful contemplation to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. That's been very much my experience in my own work with psychedelics. That there was nothing that I did working at deep levels that was mine alone, that was private, and that the pain came from a larger collective web, and the healing spread out into a larger collective web. And those exercises, the meditations that you're describing, I think really are important for changing the sort of a tilt in how we live in the universe, because according to just our physical senses, we have this feeling often that life happens to us. Life is something independent of us, and then it just happens to us, and then we're victims of it and we respond. But when you begin to send out energy into the universe, when you begin to send out healing and love into the universe, and you watch the universe respond in immediate and then indirect ways, then you begin to shift into the sense that you are living in a dynamic field. You are part of a dynamic field, living in a field, and at a very deep level and a subtle level, you are creating your universe as you go.
Mm.
Once you begin to understand that, still, that doesn't mean you're free of all the karma that's coming at you from the past. It's still working its way through the system. But increasingly, the balance of your life tilts from being kind of the passive recipient of things that you personally didn't start to being the generator of the life that you are inheriting now.
Mm. Yeah, you're no longer a victim. You're a creator. Yeah,
You're a creator.
participator.
Yes.
We got this great question. We thought we'd kind of inject into this talk, which is what happens to us when we die. So should we let's explore that? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, many other cultures. I think we wanted to mention the Tibetans because they seem to really have a handle on some of these things.
Yeah.
Egyptians as well, but you know, Tibetans perhaps are a little bit more contemporary because they're still here,
Mm-hmm.
and they're still
Yeah.
practicing very much
Yeah.
those teachings, the Bardo teachings,
And psychotherapists are now exploring this territory. Joel Witten's first book, Life Between Life, explored this, and Michael Newton's work in his books, Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls, are very systematic attempts to explore through deep states of regression, of spiritual regression, what happens to people when they go through the death process. So really we've got two halves of life. We've got birth to death, and then we've got death to birth.
Yeah.
And we've been missing this side, but really you have to understand the whole circle to really understand what happens. So yeah, let's jump into it.
Yeah. So obviously the Tibetans have coined this phrase, the Bardo, which is this in-between state, but it can also be used to describe a transformational experience, you know, because life is filled with transformational experiences.
Yeah.
But particularly when you're moving through a threshold, across a threshold, you know, like death or birth are classic thresholds. And they sit there as kind of almost an allegory of all transformation, don't they? Death and birth. So, you know, because we have so many deaths and births even within one lifetime. Yeah. So it seems like a kind of obvious logic to expand that allegory out beyond individual births and you know, and see it everywhere throughout the entire cosmos. And I know you've experienced this very profoundly in your psychedelic journeys, like this constant, you've described like those constant states of transformation that, or you've been through them in those. I mean, do you know what I'm pointing to? This constant rebirth.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, when I started the work, I thought there was just one death, ego death, that would then launch you into the spiritual universe. But what I found is, of course, the spiritual universe has many, many layers to it. And just because you're operational at certain layers doesn't mean you're operational yet at deeper layers. And you actually have to go through another metamorphosis of death and surrender to be reborn into that another layer, and so on and so forth. And that reflects the Tibetan idea of Bardo. Bardo really means a discrete layer of consciousness. And so when they're describing the after-death journey, there are multiple Bardos that manifest themselves. Now, we in the West have tended to use the term Bardo to expand on that and basically let the Bardo represent the sum total of all things that happen to us when we die on the other side. And that's a perfectly acceptable, you know, use of the term. But their use of it is in terms of stages of that progression. So there's one Bardo you pass through, another Bardo you pass through. There's the Bardo of the hungry ghosts, there's the Bardo of the heavenly spirits, and things like this. But the basic pattern, I think, that they identified is the same pattern that the psychotherapists are identifying too, that when we die, we go through a period of reunion with our soul, with our our soul lineage. And the first thing that takes place is that we debrief from our most recent life. We basically process the life that we just lived in the context of absolute love. And a love so deep is not even a matter of forgiveness. But we experience the totality of our life, all of our shortcomings, all of our good deeds in the context of infinite love. And we have the opportunity to look at our life and see what we did well and see what we didn't do well.
And we have
That,
this whole notion, don't we, of like the life flashing before you as you die, like this kind of replay
mm-hmm,
in time, in the timeless dimension, you know,
mm-hmm,
because so it makes perfect sense, like for
mm-hmm.
us to go through that deep reflection at the end of something. I mean, it's what we do in life, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think the near-death experience of the life review is a snapshot of what happens kind of in a full death experience of just a detailed reliving of every detail, every nuance, far more details than we can keep track of inside time and space. And we see how our life rippled out and touched other people. We experience how our evil deeds hurt and how our good deeds helped. And so we experience the totality of our life in the seamless fabric.
and we experience them without a physical body. So we experience them in a subtle body, which is much more intense.
Yeah.
You know, like the astral body, or as it's so called, or the mental body, these subtle layers, the causal body, you know,
Yeah.
the without the physicality, the intensity of those emotions that we probably feel or we review
Yeah.
have given rise to this notion of like eternal damnation from, you know, the Christians, for example, or even like the eternal bliss realms of the Buddhists,
Mm-hmm.
or heaven and hell, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
because there's this sense of eternity. I think it's a correct intuition, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that because when there's no time, when you're out of time and space, in that sense, you're in
Mm-hmm.
that place of grace, then an experience of, you know, of the harm you've caused or the hurt you've caused could feel like it, you know, in that moment, in that timeless space, could feel like it's infinite. You know,
Yeah.
I've caused like an intense pain, and then seeing the ripple of that pain into a
Yeah.
life and how it carries on through that being,
Yeah.
and then finally gets worked out. I mean, I don't know at
Yeah.
what level we
Yeah.
experience, but I imagine we experience a lot of the subtler dimensions of
Yeah.
our karmic, you know,
Yeah.
the passions of our karma. So
But
pretty and very intense.
yeah. But then what locks in this experience, this phenomenology of eternity, what locks it in as a metaphysical principle is the mistaken view that we only live once. So we've had our chance and there's absolutely no chance to correct it. So if you're
Appalling.
going to be accountable and if you're going to, you know, be accountable to good and you've screwed up, then you're punished forever and ever and ever. And of course, fortunately, no one finds that when they actually get into the depth of it. The past life therapists don't find that. The Buddhists don't find that. That we are accountable. We are responsible. We do experience the pain we cause others, but that's so that we can learn, and that's so that we can come back and do better next time, and better next time, and grow and grow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a lineage of of distillers in my family, and so
Ah,
I like the you know, I look at it intuitive. This is my intuitive reading of perhaps, you know, a colorful way of maybe of how this happens is that there's a distilling process, and in that, or a fermentation of some form, so that the grosser matter starts to fall down back to earth in a way.
yeah,
Like this is the notion of having these subtle bodies where the lower bodies, the astral, you know, those lower and energies that we've created fall back into the lower planes, and then
yeah,
something higher gets crystallized.
yeah,
The distillation of our life, all that was good about it, all that we've learned, is being
yeah,
distilled into this purer kind of quintessence that then stays as a and adds to our soul's trajectory. But then the lower, all that kind of elemental energy that sinks back into those lower planes of being, they also carry our karma, you know. So
hmm,
those droplets, if you like, of karma sink back down, and they you know, we still have to redress them, you know,
hmm,
although they my understanding is that they move into the collective field as well. So
hmm,
every act that we, or every word we speak, let's say, or every thought we have, goes into the collective. So the, you know,
yeah,
we are all co-creating the karma of humanity, the collective karma of humanity.
Yeah.
And then we have to return to pick up where we left off. But we have this enhanced soul, this that we've learned from. So when we return, there's more awareness present. So there is this continuity, and the other way I see it is that there's, our lives are trajectories. They're like arcs. I see it as an arc. It's like an arc. It's curving. It's always moving. Or if you looked at it, it might be a spiral, or it might have one of these kundalini shapes underneath it. Not a straight line. And that's what never ends, that arc. We follow that arc, and it goes through this portal, and it continues. And that's the lineage. That is what, if you're able to trace that arc in your inner being, then you can trace your lineage, where you've come from and where you're going. And your memory can travel down that arc. Your awareness can travel down that arc, which enables you to remember, or to predict, in the case of Tibetans, to predict where you'll return.
Yeah.
Because the awareness is aware of the arc, not just in its own life. Because if you look at an arc, it's like within one life, it may do that. But then if you can see it, if you can project it beyond this life, you can then, your awareness can predict intuitively where you're coming back. Can even, maybe even further than predict, maybe can even create, where you are going to return in some respect. So anyway, those are ideas. Yeah.
I've never been very interested in tracing my genealogy, but I have been interested in tracing the genealogy of my soul.
Yeah.
Which is what you're describing, just reaching back and basically what you might think of as deep remembering, remembering who you are, who you have been. And when you do that, you do have a certain sense of trajectory, of kind of developmental process. And you're pointing to the collective, I think, is absolutely right. What we're learning is the individual and the collective are evolving together. They are functionally separate systems, but they are deeply intertwined. So everything we're doing as an individual seeds the growth of the collective, and everything the collective is doing seeds the growth of the individual. So that when I leave, I really do believe that when I leave space-time, when I die, and even if I were to leave the entire system altogether, all of my experiences, all of your experiences will be held in perfect, I won't say duplication, because we are human beings, and everything we experience, the human species gets to hold on to. And therefore, our life experience becomes part of its life experience. Our love and understanding becomes part of its love and understanding. And it is part of its generative matrix, out of which it gives birth to the next generation of human beings. So it's a both-and situation here.
It's beautiful. Like the notion of the Akashic field that is just that is constantly remembering and growing. I love that idea.
Yeah.
And another idea I really like is the notion that comes from the Tibetans as well. This notion they call terma.
Yeah.
Which my interpretation of it is a word I might use as transmission. It means treasure. And terma are like teachings in a way, or wisdom teachings that are kind of waiting for specific teachers in time and space. And the story that is through the Tibetans is that they would, a lot of the terma were their lineage terma were dropped by their great teacher Padmasambhava, who is the second Buddha. And he kind of emanated these termas into the future, and like dropping them like kind of a bit like depth charges, at different levels of depths of time, and that they would go off at certain points where further emanations or disciples of his or teachers, or really they're kind of aspects of his greater consciousness or of that being's, that lineage, you could say, is better to say. And then they would pick up and they would go off and be discovered at certain times in certain places and periods. And this was it was a big shift in my understanding when I really understood about these terma, because that's sort of what happened to me. I had this kind of opening up that was just hanging there in time and space. And then this wisdom memory came rushing through me. And then I had to spend the rest of my life, and I still am, figuring out what I'd received and living according to it. And I think that's I mention it not just because it's part of my story, but because it's a lovely little sort of idea of how subtle and rich are the layers that survive time and space, that kind of, that and it brings us perhaps to that notion of involution that we've been thinking about. So maybe we could dive into that a bit. What is involution, Chris? Tell us.
Well, first of all, I want to stop for a moment and first to celebrate your receiving of the terma, the gene keys. You didn't make those, you receive those, and you unpack them. You take your responsibility for your half, but you only have half. The other half is like the seed that comes from above. And once you understand that reincarnation is a cycle that has a bottom half, an incarnational half, and a top half. And just as there are a community of beings in the bottom half of the cycle, there's also a community of beings in the top half, that there's layers and layers and layers of spiritual beings. It's not just reincarnating human beings, but there's angelic presences and enlightened beings presences and all sorts of beings who are here to help us gestate in our gestational cycle. And so just as there are human beings above to help us, there are the teachings above to help and infuse our teaching, so that there are these gems of ideas, gems of empowerment and so once we have the understanding that a human being who becomes aware of the dynamics of reincarnation, aware of the deep evolutionary trajectory of the soul and soul communities, the way the Tibetans have, then they naturally begin to track their great beings through time, and they track the great teachings through time, and they become sensitive to these diamonds dropping in to our minds at specific and the deep significant patterns to this process. So for me, in addition to the detail of these ideas of that there are termas, teachings, and that there are tulkus, self-consciously reincarnating beings, the deeper fabric is to begin to understand the depth and the grandeur at which reincarnation is operating. It's not simply a matter of who we were in the 17th century, and it's really a matter of it changes the parameters of our dialogue with the universe, and therefore it changes our sense of what we are, because we are a being that travels through time. We are a being that has been in the spiritual world many times, and we are incarnating more and more of these diamond teachings into our body, into our heart, into our mind, and that opens up the playing field of human experience. I think it just opens up. And I teach at a university where the religion of secular enlightenment is that the universe appeared by chance. It's been driven by random mutation. There's no meaning to your life. It's all accidental. And when you die, you're dead. That's it. When your brain stops, you're dead. And that just completely, it just is such a crushing philosophy. But this, which starts on an empirical basis, but then expands through a deeper appreciation of the dynamics of spiritual traditions, it restores meaning back to our lives. It allows us to play in a meaningful landscape of engaging the wisdom of our life with the wisdom of the universe. And the involution is that downward flow of meaning and purpose and beauty and truth into our life. And then evolution is our taking it and seeding it and growing it as best we can into the circumstances of our life.
Beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I sometimes look at involution as the future burrowing into the past, and evolution as the past spiraling towards the future. Like, so you've got these two forces, but you might also look at it as, like Aurobindo, who I know you also love, Sri Aurobindo, amazing kind of mind, and how he describes involution as seeds kind of sown deep within matter. So within matter, the spirit is there asleep. Like, take a rock, like a piece of lump of granite or a volcano or a mountain. Inside that mountain is a sleeping kind of consciousness of such beauty, but it's just waiting. It's waiting for its time, and everything, like a plant has it, and you can see a little bit more of it in a plant, and in a bird you can see it more clearly, like it's taking animation. And then a mammal, it's like even more, because it looks at you in the eyes, and it has even some of them have that emotional flavor that humans have, like dogs and horses. And then in the human, it's much more like obvious, because you can we can do this. So the spirit is, there's that notion that it's in like this, the gems that you speak of, like everything is a gem in matter. Every tiny atom contains a seed of a spiritual truth.
Yeah.
And it's just, everything is waiting its time. Everything is on this evolutionary ladder. And where evolution meets involution is kind of the eternal now.
Yes.
Just constantly, as you said, constantly creating and just recreating itself. But and also from the notion of involution and evolution, you can solve at some way, I don't know if that's the right word, but you can penetrate the old chestnut of free will and determinism. Because if you look at it from the involution perspective, you might say, well, it's all predetermined because it's all just sitting there waiting for its moment to come alive. But from the view of evolution, nothing is predetermined. Everything is like being created on, from this view. So the two of them together, like a funnel meeting, are like this. That's the paradox for me of, that's divine science that Aurobindo, by the way, just, really nailed. I mean, if you're able to read him, which not everyone is. Like the layers of subtle nuance in that man's mind stream in terms of how he penetrated this information is extraordinary. So I know he's inspired both of us. And
yes, he has. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think in some ways, it's our everyday experience that there are aspects of our life which are highly conditioned. And it's our everyday experience that we are not completely subservient to those conditions. We have a cubic centimeter of free will, which we can expand into a cubic meter of free will. We choose how we choose to meet the circumstances of our life. Whether we incubate choice, incubate a space where we look at the options and really examine deeply what we want to do, what we want to be, and enact out of that choice. And that's something we can expand on. I mean, that's how I sort of see what you're doing in Gene Tease, and correct me if I'm wrong. You're helping people make more informed choices by giving them an opportunity to sit deeply with the core, the karmic core, the swirl of their being, so they make choices on how to engage and define the outcome of that swirl.
Well, exactly, because you have in Gene Keys, it's very simple actually, because you have these three layers that shadow, gift, and siddhi. And siddhi is the involving seed, or the way I describe it often actually is it's the shadow is the seed, the gift is in the center, is the fruit, is the flower, and then the siddhi is the fruit, and the fruit also contains the seed. So there's this whole process of awakening inside us where the shadow suddenly, our what we learn from our karma, what we learn from our mistakes, what we learn from our challenges becomes this incredible treasure that, and as we unlock it and forgive ourselves and learn and evolve, then, we begin to kind of access those heightened states of consciousness. They're actually buried in those very dense places in creation. And that's our role as humans, to kind of find those dense places and be an intermediary to help unlock them, so that, that's an incredible responsibility.
Yeah. And my sense is, over the course of long time, the shadow seeds become less. They get evaporated
Yeah.
in the process of reflective awareness. And so the creative seeds become more. And the opportunity to become increasingly transparent to the intelligence of the universe increase. And if we extrapolate that, if that's true, not only for us individually, but collectively, I mean, and clearly the human race has a long way to go before it bakes all of its shadow seeds, because it seems like we have so many shadow seeds that are driving us now. But if we just step back and give the benefit of the doubt and assume that what happens for the individual, which we've seen, can happen for the collective, and that humanity as a whole is in the process, through these magnificent, deep collective dynamics, of cooking its past seeds and transcending the limitations of its past and moving forward in time, then we have reasons to hope that what the greatness of beings that we see in Tulkus, into intimate dialogue with Termas, is something that all of humanity is aspiring to, and all of humanity can become. That we can become, we are in the process of becoming a truly a species of enlightened beings, a species where we live in the light more than living in the shadows. I think we're coming out of the shadows of history into a deeper, better tomorrow.
Particularly as we start to understand the universe a little bit more, or the parameters of the universe, and we look out. I know you've got some wonderful slides you want to share, but which I think would be a great backdrop if you want to share them.
When I think about the topics that we're talking about today, like where is reincarnation taking us? What is the larger scope and purpose of rebirth? I just collect these pictures from the NASA. They send them around every day, and I collect them. And I meditate on these pictures. I try to envision the enormous distances involved and the millions and billions of stars that are involved, and the life that's burgeoning on so many of these planets, in so many of these systems. So that the sheer fertility, the profligate fertility of the universe, and the scale that the universe is thinking of in order to create and to manifest orders and orders and orders of evolving life on this magnitude. And then to appreciate that we are part of this. This has been the great burden of a one-time through metaphysics. The belief that this genius and beauty that we're seeing in these pictures, if our life is meaningless and if it's all random chance, we don't get to participate in this greatness. But if reincarnation is true, and if we are really not limited by the time that this little body lives, and if our mind is going to grow for countless incarnations, then we become intimately part of the generative creativity that we see around us in these vast, magnificent images of the universes.
And this then becomes our playground, without the physical body. This is surely where we live. This is our playground. And it could be even within the physical body, at some deep level, as a hologram, that could be a deep truth that we come to, that as above, so below truth.
Yeah.
And I know you've experienced some of that yourself in your experience, your journeys, and so have I. It's a fundamental truth I hold at the core of my being.
Yeah.
That and in my teachings also, we have this profile called a hologenetic profile, and I name it that because it is a map of the of the inner workings of our being, but it kind of it has a fractal reality that corresponds way beyond this microorganism here of one body. It is replicated throughout the cosmos. So a lot of the great alchemical teachings of the Taoists, for example, have explored this in their deep studies of and meditations, where you go within and you find the galaxies and the stars and where they exist in the glands of the body, and how everything has a correspondence. And therefore knowing those correspondences allows your awareness to travel into that reality and outside your physical body. That's as many people have experienced that in dreams or in astral projection or deep meditation or psychedelic journeying. I mean, feel free to share some of your experiences in that.
Well, I've done that as carefully as I can in my book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. But I think the invitation is to appreciate. I mean, look, we only became conscious of the Mother Universe about 5,000 years ago. We began to be sufficient discipline to drop beneath the conditioning of our individual egoic mind and to tap into that stream of consciousness that we share with all life. I mean, we've been walking upright for 5.8 million years. We've been operating with our larger brain about 200,000 years. Writing came in about 5,000 years ago. The Upanishadic breakthroughs came in about 3,000-4,000 years ago. But these are nothing compared to the billions and billions of years that lie ahead of us. We're just waking up. We're just waking up to who we are. And so naturally we kind of get confused given the enormity of what we're growing into. But I think the meditation exercises that you're describing and those philosophical and spiritual traditions which have begun to recognize the correspondence between the above and the below, naturally we begin to enter into exercises where we intentionally sort of reinforce the hybrid nature of our life, that we are a spiritual being and we are a physical being. We are both pure light and we are pure green. And there are correspondences in our body which correspond to the correspondence of the realities out there. And the more we can internalize and reinforce them and strengthen them in our meditational exercises, then we become a more conscious mixing pot, a more conscious kind of mortal and pestle, integrating the above and the below. Mm-hmm. And if we keep this up for a few tens of thousands of years and a few millions of years, I mean, I sometimes would tell my students, the only serious question we should be asking ourselves is, what do you want to be in a million years? Because you're going to be here in a million years. Mm-hmm. So let's get down to it. What is our deepest heart's desire? What can we do?
The fundamental question. Yeah. I heard a couple of weeks ago, I heard a really interesting talk by Roger Penrose. You know him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Really imaginative, top level physicist in the world today. Yeah. And he was saying how because there's this notion that the universe is, as it's expanding in physics, it's getting further and further apart and slowing down. It's going to reach steady state, and then we're all going to end up in this kind of slightly distant, dead, lonely kind of stopping point. And that's not his intuition, or at least the way he describes it is that when you reach that stopping point, it's the same as if you've gone incredibly fast, as if everything's come together again. Because one end of the spectrum meets the other end of the spectrum, so you wouldn't be able to tell if things are slowing down. It actually might be that they look like they're speeding up. And anyway, so this is my paraphrasing what he said, but the thing that really blew me away from a physicist to say was that he said the way he would understand it is that the logic of and the kind of elegance of the universe would be such that kind of condensing point would then give birth to another universe out of itself, like, which seems to be an elegant logic that the universe already does, as we started by saying rebirth, and then leads to another birth and another eon. But then he even went further, and he said the background radiation that we see through our furthest telescopes that can now see like the very, very beginnings of the universe. He said that there are certain objects that we're seeing in there, and I can't quite remember what he called them, but there are certain shapes and patterns and things that you're seeing, and you see them over and over again. And his assumption was that those were the leftovers from the previous eon, from the previous universe that we're seeing. And that really blew me away. I was like, wow, that's from a physicist, who's willing to kind of, who's kind of, I don't know, reached the top of his game. He's able to kind of take a few leaps. But that really seemed to me to be,
I've heard Irvin Laszlo describe once you reflect on the extraordinary precision of the unfolding of our universe in the Big Bang, that just, the magnitude of the perfection of the balance of elements that had to be present in the first picoseconds for it to unfold as it has. Then his hypothesis was, well, do we think that this is the first time the universe has tried this? That there have been expansions and contractions and expansions and contraction, and the universe is learning, and perhaps this isn't the first Big Bang. Perhaps this is the thousandth Big Bang, and it's learned from its previous experiences, and that's that background radiation, the traces of which are there.
And it's constantly ironing out flaws and perfecting and perfecting and perfecting itself.
Yeah. But of course, this wide view, I think it's rich to take the wide view, to take the deep view, and to look at very special developed beings who are kind of pushing the edge of this large view. But I want to bring it back down to, okay, how does this impact me here today? Mm-hmm. How does this help me live with the immediate problems that I'm dealing with, or with the immediate choices that I'm living with? And I think it does, in the sense that it's an invitation to look at our life as an intentional, intelligent convocation of circumstances, not as a meaningless and not as a blind, deterministic combination of circumstances. And if we engage our life circumstances as an intentional challenge, chosen for us by us at a time when we knew more, and we start to make choices in terms of, out of that deeper sense of engagement, that our choice does matter, even if we don't see how it changes things immediately, we can trust that it does change things in the long term, then I think we will find that life changes. The circumstances of our life changes. Things that were hard become soft. Things that were barren becomes richer. That's your experience, I'm sure, with Gene Keys.
Yeah, and it gives us, like, for me, it gives us like a different kind of backdrop with which to tackle the problems of the world. So the problems that we see today around us that worry us so much, it gives us an empowered view from a much wider view, like to look at what we've just been looking at, those cosmic background
Yeah.
images, and then you come to the world today and you look at this tiny little blue planet with its problems, and and they're very real, and they're causing a great deal of suffering. They always have done, but they're more easily seen than ever before.
Yeah.
And we've enacted them globally because of our technology. So we are, it means that for me, I'm constantly reminding people that, action that comes from a state of trust is very different from action that comes from fear.
Yeah.
So if we can dive into that field of wider trust, and we begin to make friends with our own death, instead of being something that's kind of like, oh, it's coming, I'm running out of time. Instead of like that view, having this long-term view as an individual, and even like what I'm doing is as a community, like how about if a whole community of people on the same wavelength play with this together? Like, we're all going to come back, we're going to return, and we're going to return into this same, this is why I've created these teachings. I haven't created, they've appeared, because we can come back into them, and we can begin to like, and the teachings are just the teachings. They're just enable us to kind of give a focal point so that we can do our work, our continuous, progressive, evolutionary work as communities, rather than like, okay, you've done this great work and then you've gone, and I might be reborn, but where?
Yeah.
But if you're reborn into the same community of beings, of souls, who are all committed to transmuting karma of the planet, and come in with different gifts and genius and skills in different locations around the world, but we're interconnected through the internet and through a body of teachings that kind of have a resonance in our soul. So we recognize them again, even as a child. And synchronicity helps us to find them. Suddenly it's a different playground again. It's like, you don't have to say goodbye to all your loved ones forever. You're going to remember them in a different way. You're going to bring more of that awareness down through the transitionary bardo, and bring it. And the more of us that do that incarnate the memory through the bardos forwards in time, the more it kind of, this is my intuition, the more it will open up the bardos themselves, so that more and more people can remember. And it's all a game of memory. I think that, like the more awareness the more we play and participate, the more that memory opens up. Because memory is a strange thing, isn't it? Like, even individual memory, there are memory tricks you can do to, and you can, and therapeutically, you can take someone back into their memories, so there are things that you can do to enhance memory, and there are things you can do forwards in time to ensure that you don't forget. There are triggers, that you can, there are lots of ways of playing with this, but there are things you can do, as the lamas do, the tulkus, they sometimes leave objects that they retrieve in the next life. And there's lots of tricks within, once you know the time that, once you kind of found the way through the wormholes, I think you can play more and then we can bring more and more awakening, into the collective, and I think that changes everything.
It does. I think we're shifting slowly from living an ego-based life, which is grounded in this incarnation, to living a soul life, which is grounded into this much, much deeper life in the universe. And it always struck me as significant that in the classical story of the Buddha's enlightenment, and when he went through the 4 watches of the night, in one of the watches of the night, he saw all of his former lives. They all became living part of his awareness. Now, to see your former lives, to remember your former lives, is not simply to remember who you were, but you bring all of that life experience into who you are. So for me, to see, to remember your former lives is to become the soul which which gathers all that knowledge and all that experience into one place. And when he did that, he became transparent and shattered. He stopped the suffering. And the suffering is fundamentally living small, living as if this body is the only thing that is you. And I think this is happening historically. We are, as you say, the more we bring that memory forward, the more we live that memory, the more we see that memory into the future. Another way of saying this is to say we are practicing the skills of soul inside time and space. And as our soul gets stronger, we begin to remember and have an intuitive feeling for relationships that we have a deeper history with. And if people come at us as enemies, well, let's heal them. I'm sorry what I did to you, whatever it was, let me make it up to you. But more and more allies come. And because there's a waking up is a social process. It's a generative process which has never ever been private at any time in history. And I think this is what's happening. I think the soul is waking up inside time and space, that the human species is basically growing up on a scale the likes of which is really comparable about like 200,000 years ago when we made the jump to our bigger brain. Except now the physical plant isn't changing, but the awareness that is supported by the physical plant seems to be changing exponentially. So I know that you and I share a vision of history that we're entering into a very, very challenging time, a time of darkening shadows. So I hope in our next conversation, we can begin to put together our understanding of the dynamics of this period of history that we're entering and the dynamics of soul growth that we both affirm so deeply.
Yeah, and how those two fit perfectly together. What you've called the birth of the diamond soul, and I also happen to call it the diamond awareness.
Yeah.
And it is that memory that transcends the lifetimes, and that maintaining that memory between lives ensures, I mean, for one thing, suddenly many people who I'm engaged with, like, they're suddenly excited by being here and by returning, as opposed to, I want to get out of here.
Yeah.
Which has been the prevalent kind of feeling among spiritual communities. I want to get out of here. Yeah. This is my last incarnation. I'm off. and that's, I think there's a more compassionate view, and I think a more exciting view, that, we can actually bring, and it's like a warrior's view as well, spiritual warrior, like this place needs us. It needs us here to do this work. So I think that's why we're having these conversations for me.
Yeah. I don't think the creative genius that gave birth to the galaxies and planets inside the galaxies and solar systems would inculcate, and it created reincarnation. We didn't create it. The religions didn't create it. Nature created it. And I don't think it would create reincarnation to grow us to an awareness of our first inkling of our deep, deep spiritual essence, with the purpose being, okay, then you can go. Then you can go. I think we've missed it. We don't understand that awakening is a process which really is part of the transformation of time and space itself, that we are here to change. We are changing the world. It really is heaven on earth is what the process is about.
Yeah. And the prophecy.
Yeah. On the prophecy.
Let's leave that as a seed for next time. And
that sounds good.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. What a fantastic.
Yes. And I'll just leave with this thought. I wonder what our personal former life history is that we meet in such ease and fruitful dialogue, you and I. And so I honor the history between us, whatever it is.
I will contemplate that.
Yeah. Much love.
Great. Thank you.